let's get back to the Federal Reserve. It gets an A on its report card for objective number 1, which is to maintain control over the money markets in New York. Did they reverse the trend toward private capital formation? Boy, did they ever. With interest rates brought down periodically to such attractive levels, individuals and corporations have been enticed away from saving their own money and going to the bank. You'd be a fool not to get that money at those low interest rates. Of course, then the economy contracts and things go a little sour now and then, and the fruit falls from the tree, and they pick it up. They get all your marbles. They get all your assets, your houses, your cars, your factories, your stocks, and your bonds. That's one of the reasons we've had so many bankruptcies in the decades past. Even those companies today which are hanging in there by the skin of their teeth, because it's all they can do to make payments to service their debt to the banks. Notice that many of those companies are now sending more money to the banks as interest on their loans than they send to their stockholders as dividends on their stocks. Think about that. The banks which created the money out of nothing, no effort at all, no risk really of anything, are making more money out of these giant industries than the people who worked for the money, sacrificed, saved the money, invested it, and risked it. And yet the money is going to the banks. Yes, the Federal Reserve System, in fact, gets an A on its report card for reversing the trend toward private capital formation, and they did it with a flexible currency, just as they had planned to do it. And what about the third objective, which was to pass the losses onto the taxpayers in the name of protecting the people? That is something which I call in my book Operation Bailout, the game called Bailout. You may have noticed every time a large bank gets into trouble, not the small banks, they're dispensable. The large banks, when they get into trouble, they're going to be bailed out by the government, which means by your tax dollars and mine, in the name of protecting the people. It doesn't make any difference if there's if it's a private corporation or a city municipality or a third world country. Whoever has borrowed megabucks from these banks and now can't service their debt anymore, they have trouble making those interest payments, which is all banks care about. They don't want you to pay back the loan, because they'd have then just the problem of finding somebody else to lend it to. They don't want you to pay back your loan. They want you to pay the interest on the loan and keep those loans going forever. And finally, when people have trouble making those interest payments, and it looks like the bank is going to have to write it off of its books, what happens? They go to Congress. And they say, well, this corporation that's having trouble making its interest payments, we can't let that corporation fold, because look how many thousands of jobs would be lost and people would go on welfare. There would be despair. We must protect the people. Or if it's a third world country that can't make its interest payments anymore, they say, well, we can't allow that to happen. We must make those payments for them in some way or another, because if that venerable bank had to write that huge loan off of its books, it would technically be bankrupt. And if it were bankrupt, it might have to close its doors. If that bank were to fall, it's such a huge bank, it'd be like a domino, and it might knock the other banks down too, and we could have a major economic crisis on our hands, and look how the people would suffer. And so Congress dutifully always responds. Remember, Congress is the partner in this scam. Always rushes in and says, yes, we can't allow those bad things to happen to the people. And so they vote the money to guarantee the loans or make outright payments in some very creative fashions so that the interest can continue flowing to the banks. Some of the more memorable games you may have missed over the recent years: Penn Central Railroad was bailed out in 1970, Lockheed Corporation that same year, Commonwealth Bank of Detroit in 1972, New York City in 1975, Chrysler in 1978, First Pennsylvania Bank in 1980, Continental Illinois, the largest of the banks so far, in 1982, and of course we know how many third world countries out there have had their debts funded. The money comes from the IMF, World Bank, so they can continue making their payments. And the IMF World Bank gets their money from the Federal Reserve System, and the Federal Reserve System gets it from us in the form of that mandrake mechanism and the hidden tax called inflation, or direct taxes in some cases. The Federal Reserve System gets an A on its report card on all three of its true objectives.